in the United States. So we go to the University of Minnesota, where Jim Salfer and Marcia Endres will be sharing insights into robotic milking from their perspective. Jim has a great extended background in extension. He's a regional extension educator for the University of Minnesota. And Marcia Endres is a professor in dairy cattle production. Both of them are AMS experts in our online AMS community. And together with Marcia Endres and some others that will be joining us later today, we are part of the International Precision Dairy Farming Association. So it's great to find another event where we can share kind of knowledge and expertise. So Jim, I've enabled your microphone now.
Okay.
Can
All
you
right.
minimize, sorry, can you minimize the weather thing on the,
Yeah, I just put that in here because this is the weather
ah,
we're going to have the next couple of days. This is a screenshot off my phone.
ah,
So for you,
perfect then. No, so then I thought it was a floating bar. Then it's absolutely fine. The floor is
yeah.
yours.
So for you folks in the southern hemisphere, you can see tomorrow we're 16 below Celsius for a high, and the next day we're 17 below. So that's kind of where we're at. So with that, I'm going to be talking a little bit about overview and then some of the economic data from some of our farm management information and some farm observations, and then Marcia will be presenting more on some of the research that we've done. So with that, I'll get started. Kind of the history of robotic milking, of course, in the US, we're really quite a bit behind maybe the rest of the world as from an early installation standpoint. The first farm in the US was actually a farm in Wisconsin here in the upper Midwest. They installed 2 robots in 2000. And then in 2005, Mason-Dixon, which is out in Pennsylvania, which is a really progressive farm, they installed 10 robots. And then in 2009, they expanded to 20 robots. But since about 2000, especially here in the upper Midwest of Minnesota, Wisconsin, there's really been a reasonably rapid adoption rate. And it just tends to grow a little bit exponentially now here in the upper Midwest, especially and throughout the US. Okay, the current state of the industry, it's estimated that maybe about 2.5% of the farms have robots. If you look at the US right now, we have about 38,000, 37,000 dairy farms. So that's about 800 farms nationally. And most of them are in the real traditional kind of the area with a lot smaller average herd size. So that would be the northeastern United States, especially Pennsylvania and New York, and then in the Midwest US, so that'd be kind of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Iowa, kind of that area. There's really a limited number in the West and the Southwest, and a lot of that is just because of their traditionally extremely large herd size compared to the other area. And you can see on the bottom of the screen, a lot of that is because these early installations were really on smaller farms. Most of them were 1 to 4 robots. Every once in a while, you'd see one that was 7 or 8 robots. But recently, there's a lot more interest in installation large farms, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. Most of the cows in our robotic dairies are housed in freestall barns. There's a few in compost barns. Less than 10% of them are in grazing barns. So most of them are kind of in our traditional freestall barns. And, you know, maybe early on, about 2/3 of those were retrofits in existing freestall barns. Now we're seeing more brand new facilities because they're seeing that cow flow is a little bit better and they get a little bit better performance when you look at that. Here's some of the things that are really driving AMS adoption in US as we visit with farms and do our projects. As I mentioned earlier, initially it was really the small farms that had a lot of interest in adopting AMS systems. And the number one reason, of course, was lifestyle. And some of these farms wanted to expand without hiring labor. They were maybe bringing a son or a daughter back in. They maybe had an old tie stall system and they knew they had to update, and they thought robots were really going to be a future, so they installed robots. And the other thing is really this improved human health. As these tie stall barns have gotten bigger, we've got a lot of farms that have knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulders, surgeries, and so they really didn't want that as part of themselves. Their parents had that. But now a lot of larger farms are looking at robots. And a couple of the biggest concerns, probably the biggest, is future labor availability. Our unemployment rate is very low, as some of the other speakers had said. It's just really hard to find people that are willing to milk cows on a dairy farm. The other one is a concern about future labor costs. Labor costs in farms are going up much more rapidly than the average labor cost in the United States. And again, part of that is just the difficulty of finding people. And then of course, there's a decreased time for recruiting, hiring, training, and managing labor. And as you go to robots, especially for large farms, there's less of that. Looking at some of the challenges with robotic systems, probably the biggest challenge facing people here in the US is economics. We've got a nice database at the University of Minnesota. It's called FinBin. And I summarized information from 2015 to 2018. These are actual on-farm records. And so you can see the average robot net farm income was a negative $12 per cow over this 4-year period of time. Then I looked at just the top 40% of robot farms. Their average return was plus $600 per cow. So you can see that the good robot farms are doing very well, and they're actually doing better than the average non-robot farm. And when I looked at this, I sorted the farms so I'd have about the same size farms. So this isn't all the non-robot farms. I took out the farms that were over 500 cows because there really are very few robot farms that size in the database. You can see they average $222 per cow. Just looking at a little bit, and these are all raw averages. With this database, there's no really way to run statistics on this, but just comparing milk production, as you might expect, most of the conventional farms milk twice a day. So the average robot farm averaged about 11,000 kilos, a little over 11,000 kilos or liters per cow per year. And that's about 590 kilos more than the average cow in the conventional herd, and actually about the same as the top 40% of the robotic herds. Where the top robot herds really had an advantage was in labor efficiency. They averaged about 82,000 liters per full-time worker more than the average robot herd. And the average robot herd averaged about a little over 1 million pounds of a million liters of milk, I'm sorry, 1 million liters of milk for a full-time worker. And that was about 400,000 liters more than our conventional dairies. And a lot of these conventional dairies, again, are smaller dairies, and some are still in tie-stall barns, little smaller parlors. The big advantage is kind of on the cost side of it. So when you look at the top 40% of the robot herds, they had actually about a 1 cent per liter lower feed cost, and they actually had a little higher milk price. They averaged about 1.6 liters higher milk price. So the top 40%, just for your reference, the top 40% robot herds averaged about 37.8 cents per liter, and that was about the same as a conventional herd. And that's something we consistently see. These little lower profit, especially the robot herds, just don't have the value milk. Now this database, it's hard to know because they don't have components and somatic cell count, but chances are it's kind of related to either the components, so the fat or the protein, or maybe a little bit in somatic cell count. The other thing that's a little bit different from a cost standpoint is the repairs are higher in the robotic dairies. Utilities are higher in the robotic dairies. But the other thing on the cost standpoint, since most of our robot dairies are pretty new, the interest paid by farmers is about twice in the robot herds versus conventional, and also depreciation is quite a bit higher. So those are kind of the economic numbers. It really takes other challenges. It takes a very different type of manager and employee skill set than it takes in our traditional dairy. As I mentioned, maintenance and repair costs are a concern. Training first lactation heifers, I've heard a few other speakers talk about that, and Marcia will be talking more about that, and then dealing with alarms. Some of the key to success, some of our early surveys and even the current surveys say feed management ranked very high. And that wasn't, we thought maybe pellets would come up higher, but feed management was consistent feeding times, consistent pushing up, consistent particle size, consistent moisture. Seems whenever that gets off, it really affected visits and milk production. And finding nutritionists that like working with robots, of course, is an advantage. One thing, this is from visiting with a lot of farms that average, or not a lot, but some farms that average over 40 kilos per cow per day. They really say some of the keys are special observation of fresh cows, observing rumination, the palatability of the PMR as well as a robot, and fetching these fresh cows. So you can see this is kind of the cascade I think about as I'm trying to explain to people on success on robots. It's really important to think about having a really excellent pre-calving diet, because a really good pre-calving diet, of course, promotes high post-calving intake, healthy cows. Once you get healthy cows, you get early good visits because those cows feel good. They feel like eating, they feel like coming to the robot. That drives milk production, that drives PMR intake. And then of course, the high PMR intake gets more milk production. And it's just, once you get the success going on these cows, ultimately your goal is to have high visits, high production, high intake, and a healthy herd. So Marcia, again, will be talking a lot more about this, but high milk per cow and per robot. As I mentioned in the previous slide, high early lactation visits promotes intake and high milk production. High early lactation visits, you also get higher late lactation visits, and high milk per cow is correlated with high milk per robot. So with that, I'm done, Nico, and you can turn it over to Marcia.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that. Really a lot of good information there. So there's already some questions coming through, but we'll tackle them at the end. So I'll now share presenter rights with Marcia.
Great. So thank you again, Nico, for organizing this. It's been very interesting so far. Too bad I cannot be probably here in the middle of the night to hear my European colleagues, but this is great. As Jim said, I'll be just touching base a little bit on some of the research we've been doing here at the university. And it takes a village, not just the two of us. So I want to first of all acknowledge my grad students. The one with me on the picture is Justin Seward. Justin did a Master's of Science degree with me here in the Department of Animal Science, where I'm a professor in dairy production, as was mentioned earlier. And he graduated last year. And the picture on the right is Matteo Spiter. He is a current grad student with me doing his PhD. And one of the topics of his research is robotic milking too. And then besides them, there'll be a number of undergrads and junior scientists and people like that, and company folks that have helped us collect data for our research. So basically our research here, we do not have a dairy farm within our university system that uses robotic milking. So what we do, we conduct observational studies working with farms, primarily in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So we've done different projects. I'll be showing results from a couple of the larger ones we did. So the data that we're getting is basically looking at, generating new hypotheses, if you will, generating relationships between factors that are influencing milk production on the farm. And then maybe then we rely on folks like some of the ones in the call today that have their own farms with robots that can do then a more controlled type of study to basically look if there are any causality to the relationships that we find. And a lot of times those relationships do make a lot of sense to producers, so they might act on those. And also the data we're getting from these farms is really fitting in with what Jim was talking earlier about some of the key drivers and the key things that make robots successful. I think our research is actually being able to show that. I'll start with the first project we did. This one was one of Justin's projects where we looked at looking at about this is only free flow farms for this study, where we look at factors that were influencing productivity. And I'm just showing one of the factors here that has to do with management, and that was the use of an automatic feed pusher. At the time we did the study, only about a third of our farms, 35%, were actually using automatic feed push-up. And we saw almost a 5-kilogram difference in milk production per cow when farms were using an automatic feed push-up. And this is data we published last year in the Journal of Dairy Science. Our current study that's ongoing, and we presented abstracts on this and different conferences this year, is looking at, again, on the free flow farms. We're looking at analyzing various factors that were collected from the robot data and also from undergrad student that we had that visited the farm and interviewed the producer to get information about management practices, and also took note of some housing aspects of the farms. So what we do then, we do what's called multivariable analysis. Initially, we look at the outcome of interest, in this case, milk production per cow. That's one of the models that we built. And the other one we do is milk production per robot. And the results are very similar between the two, so I decided to, for the sake of time, focus only on the milk production per cow here for the slides. So basically, we start this analysis. We had about 38 farms, so close to 40 farms in this particular data set. I start by looking at all the variables that we collected, and there was probably over 40 different variables, and each of those variables looking at the relationship of those with the milk production per cow. And then if we had a p-value that was more lower, less than 0.3, those variables go into what we call a multivariable model. And then we start removing any factors until all the factors have a p-value less than 0.05. So all the significant factors will stay in the model. And we had about 15 factors in this study that stay in the model. So one that we always find, and we found also in the study we did with Justin, because we also had a similar thing going on for that study. We had, in that case, 33 farms for that study. We found that the amount of concentrate that's offered in the robot has a positive association with milk production. And estimate means that for each kilogram increase in concentrate offered, we have estimate production of 1 kilogram of milk, 1.024. Obviously, there's a limit to this. Our farms are feeding on average 5.5 kilos of concentrate. And again, these are free flow farms. Our guided flow farms feed less than that. 5.5 kilos is the average, up to a maximum. A high producing cow might be getting 10 kilos or 11 kilos of concentrate per day. So that relationship is one that we always find. So basically, farms are feeding more concentrate and more productive. Another one is milking speed. And we see a very big estimate here for milking speed and for number of milkings per day. So this is very important, as Jim was mentioning, making sure visits are happening to the robot. More milkings per day was a very significant association with milk production per cow. And then the time that it takes to milk also was positively associated with milk production. Now, looking at things that were negatively associated with milk production per cow, one is rest feed. So that is the feed that was programmed to be consumed by the cow that did not get consumed. So we need to be careful we need to make sure the cow is able to consume all the feed that's programmed for her, because then we're not feeding a cow to their requirement if they don't consume all the feed that was programmed. So we do see a negative relationship, and as you can see, it's even larger than the concentrate that's offered. We see a negative relationship of 2.136. So basically, we're going to see a reduction in milk if the cow does not consume the concentrate. We always find also, seems to be in the studies that we do, a negative relationship with refusals per cow and milk production. So we'd like to have refusals, and refusals is a cow that is not time for her to be milked. She walked into the box, the robot box, and it's not time for her to be milked yet, based on permission settings. Milking permission settings. So she's kicked out of the robot and she does not get milked. We like to see cows doing so. We like to see that cows are coming in and out of the robot. They're used to going, they're well trained, etc. But maybe there's a point of a negative return here where we need to be finding the happy medium where we do not take time away from the robot that should be milking other cows. So that might be a reason why we find this negative relationship here. And then the treatment time is a time that's not milking time, is the time it takes to prep that cow. And we found, again, a negative relationship here. So we should try to optimize treatment time in robot boxes. And we did see a minor, very small relationship here with number of cows per robot. I'm not going to focus too much on that. And this relationship was negative for milk production per cow, and it was positive for milk production per robot. So again, if you can, everything being equal, if you can keep milk production similar or high, and you have more cows per robot, you're going to have greater productivity, right? But then you have to be careful that we do not put so many cows in the pen that now we reduce the production per animal. So that is something that we have to play when we look at robotic systems. And days in milk and those things have to be in the model to adjust the model, because we want to make sure that that's adjusted for the differences in days in milk and different farms. And these are all based on farm averages, but it's a 1 year of data. So we have daily milk information, daily robot software data. So it's a large data set in the sense that we get repeated measures on these farms for the whole year. And when you look at housing factors that were associated with milk production, we found that automatic scraping was positively associated with milk production per cow and per robot. And that is something that makes some sense, because when cows are not disrupted and they have the freedom to go to the robot and to the feed bunk and to rest without being disrupted, it's more likely that they'll be more productive. And about 75% of our farms actually are using automatic scraper systems now, which was not the case in our first study. I think we've seen an increase in the number of farms using automatic scrapers and also automatic feed pushers. In our first study, we only, with data collected back in the 2013-14, we only had about 33% of the farms with automatic feed pushers, and now we're about 70% of the farms. So as being a move in that direction, because we understand the importance of having feed availability, feed access to the cows. We also found something here that we don't quite understand yet. Mateus actually presented this data today too at the seminar for the department, and we found that farms that had natural ventilation instead of cross or tunnel ventilation on their farms had actually a higher production, milk production per cow and per robot, and that might have something to do with the type of farms we had in the data set, because we know heat abatement is very important. Could also be that the natural ventilated farms in our data set really had a good heat abatement system, meaning they had a lot of fans and sprinklers, as these farms tend to be quite automated and quite, farmers that have automatic systems tend to be very progressive farmers. So it could be just a little bit an artificial thing here in the sense that those farms just had better ventilation, even the natural ventilated farms. But we found this relationship surprising, as we thought cross-vent farms would actually be the highest, but that was not the case. We also found that in terms of management factors, one that is kind of a new one, that in the first study when we did with Justin, basically no farms were feeding more than one type of feed in the robot. And now we have about, you can see here that we have all the way to farms that are feeding 3 different types of feed, depending on the stage of lactation, depending on where the cow is in her production in terms of production level. They might have, like, say, a high production pellet and a low production pellet, or they might have a fresh cow pellet, or they might basically spray the pellet for fresh cows with something that helps fresh cows to really do well. So we see that the benefit of feeding at more feeds, or have the option of more precisely feeding cows, coming up as a positive association with more milk production per cow and per robot. And this is a new trend. Like I said earlier, we will not see this. And now we're seeing quite a few more farms using 2 different types of feeds in the robot than in the past. And it's still only 10% of them in this data set were using 3 feeds. So that's still relatively not so common. We also found that the PMR feeding frequency, how many times per day the producer was delivering the feed at the feed bunk for the partial mixed ration. The best combination here, the best option was 2x, so feeding cows twice a day. Again, we would expect 3 times and more to be actually even better, which we didn't find that relationship statistically. Again, be careful, because this only represents 10% of the farms. So it's really hard to judge if this feeding more frequently would be positive when we only have about 10% of the farms represented. But however, 2x definitely was better than 1x, and about half and half will be 40-some percent 2x, 40-some percent 1x. So the advantage of feeding twice has been demonstrated here potentially. But again, this is not causality, so we need to do more research. Another thing that I like to also present here back to Justin Seward's work, we published this earlier this year in Journal of Dairy Science. Jim mentioned earlier that one of the challenges that producers bring to us is training heifers, and how it seems to be more difficult to get heifers going, if you will, using robots. And if you look at data set here, this is actually 40 farms, which included about 23% of them were guided flow, and remainder were free flow. We see that heifers, this first lactation cows, the primiparous cows, you can see here on the graph, the first 4 weeks in lactation, they did not visit the robot as frequently as older cows, and took about until the 8th month in lactation before the heifers were visiting the robot as often as cows. So again, they do take a little bit longer to learn and to start going into the robot. They also had less refusals. Took them about a month, a little over a month, to have similar refusals as cows. So again, there is some training that's needed here to get those cows going. So I'm going to skip this one. We did see some advantage of training heifers to use the robot. This is a case study we did that was presented last year. So by training cows to use the robot, we increased milking visits by 1.3 more visits in early lactation, as you can see here on the graph. And also, we also have noticed that milk production in general appears to be increasing in our farms here in the US. Comparing the two data sets, this 47 farms, including guided and free flow farms, 1818 kilos per robot. In the older data set, now we're actually averaging 2200 kilos per robot with this about 50 farms we have in this study by doing with Mateo Spider. So almost 5,000 pounds of milk per robot. It's amazing. And also the milking speed has gone up in our studies, which might indicate that we are getting better at using robots. The robots themselves might be getting better, and producers are more knowledgeable, and we have better cows that are being selected maybe for more higher speeds. So more cows per AMS. We have also about, this is in the free flow system, about close to 60 cows now per robot on average. Our guided flow farms have more than that. This is a free flow. And we see this happening in our world here in the US. So I think there is an improvement in efficiency, and I think we see in the future more and more improvements in terms of how robots are being used in the US. And I'll finish again with this chart that Jim put together, which shows again the importance of driving cows to eat the PMR, to go to the robot and visit the robot, which is going to drive milk production and then keep our cows healthier and more productive. So thank you. I think I have 1 minute left, sorry, and go from there. We have our emails here for you guys to contact us later if you have follow-up questions. Thank you again, Nico, for this excellent opportunity and for putting this together. Very good. Thank you.
Perfect, Marcia. Thank you very much to you and to Jim for your time. There is quick time for 2 questions, one for each of you. But it's been a great presentation, and it's I think it's an acknowledgement of the work you're doing with your farmers and the great numbers and data that you're collecting. The first one for Jim is around, Jim, you mentioned that AMS farmers are getting higher feed efficiency or lower feed costs and higher labor efficiency. Are farmers looking at that as a driver to install robots? And the question for Marcia is around, are farmers looking to improve milk production per cow or milk production per robot, from your understanding? So I don't know who wants to answer first.
I can go first. I'll just short answer. Yeah, I think that's one of the main drivers is, interestingly, you hear from a lot of farmers that feed costs are a lot higher, but none of our databases can pick that up. There's also some data looked at in Pennsylvania. So I don't think specifically they look at feed costs, but they are writing a lot bigger check to their co-op for these pellets. But we just can't seem to find where feed costs are higher with robotic dairies. Matter of fact, they're the same or maybe just a touch lower. And yes, labor efficiency is one of the big things. And it's a combination of also more milk per cow. And so when you look at more milk per cow, you get more milk per worker. But that is, especially on small farms and large farms, that's one of the main drivers is labor efficiency.
Thank you, Jim, for that one. Marcia?
So in our case, Yeah, so
Yep.
in our case, as maybe you guys are aware, the U.S. market, we have very tight margins, and sometimes we have no, return on investment on dairy. So it's really tight. So we need to optimize and really get as much milk per robot as we can. But there is a very strong relationship or correlation between milk production per cow and milk production per robot. So basically, if we can improve milk production per cow, we automatically probably in most cases we increase also milk production per robot, Nico. So I think they go hand in hand. However, you don't want to be that, we don't want to put so many cows in a pen so that we cause a reduction in production per animal, that we cause problems in terms of cow comfort and things like that. So we have to find that balance where we can reach this goal, which our goal is to have more than 5,000 to 6,000 pounds or 22 kilos, I guess, per robot as a goal, because we need to do this in order to pay the bills. So milk production per robot is very key for the US market. Maybe it's not as important in other markets like Canada, where they have a quota system, where they might be focusing on have less cows per pen, and they don't have to necessarily, or less cows per robot than we do. So we have to optimize both things: cows per robot, milk per cow, and milk per robot.
Excellent. Marcia, Jim, thank you very much for your time and sharing these insights with the audience. It's been a pleasure. So thank you very much again, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you, Nico. Appreciate it.
No worries. Have a good evening.